Welcome to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. On this podcast, we believe that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women and non-binary people are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. With our team of experienced writing coaches as co-hosts, we'll share insights and talk to inspiring guests to bring you the practical strategies, systems, and mindset shifts you need to find time to write, publish work you love, and design your career on your terms. And it all starts with writing. Let's go. Hello, and welcome back to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. I'm your host, Kathy Mazak. And I am very excited to introduce you to our next podcast series. All right, so I have been re-releasing old episodes that are themed in like a series throughout this last year. And I'm going to continue that now in 2025. And our next series is called Should I Quit Academia? So the inspiration behind this series was that I did a episode that was called How to Know If It's Time to Quit Academia. And that episode is also on YouTube as a video. And it has gotten so much reaction and traction. And many people have actually found me through that episode. So we will be republishing that episode as part of this series, but also some other episodes from the past that are related to making a decision or how to think about this question that has passed through many people's minds, which is this for me? Like, should I quit? Is this what I really want and what I want to do? And I would say that also in light of the current kind of political situation in the US and what feels like a lot of instability and what actually, let me say honestly, is a lot of instability inside of academia, you might be thinking about this question. So I hope that this podcast series helps you, gives you tools and ways to consider the question, should I quit academia? So you'll be hearing some older episodes and some new ones as well. I'm working on some new content here that will be part of this series, and I can't wait for you to have a listen. Please remember that the very best way to show your love for this podcast is to recommend it to a colleague. And maybe or definitely the best way is to recommend one of these series that I've been doing. So if you have a colleague that you've been talking to who maybe you've had this conversation about quitting academia, maybe you've entertained the idea, even if you've jokingly said oh, here's my backup plan, then please share this podcast series. The best thing to do is share a specific episode that you enjoyed with someone. And I would really appreciate that very much. Also, a little note, anything that you hear that is from the past, some of these episodes will be from my first 50 episodes in the podcast. You might hear me talking about other offers, other programs, other things. But please know that the only program that is on offer right now is our Navigate program. There's plenty of back episodes where you can hear all about Navigate, and you can get on the wait list by going to scholarsvoice.org/navigate. By getting on the wait list, you will be the first to know when we open our next cohort. So I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day and enjoy the series, Should I Quit Academia? Hello, it's Kathy Mazak, and welcome to the last episode in our Should I Quit Academia series. You're going to hear me a little grovelly today, getting over the cold that's being passed around fourth grade. But I am so glad to be here with you for a new episode to kind of round out this last series. And today we're going to talk about, should I quit academia because of who is the president now? So this is a very timely episode. If you're listening at some other time, it might not hit as hard. It is March 17th when I am recording. So please keep that in mind as you process the information, because we are definitely on shifting sands right now. So one of the things that is clear in the current administration in the United States is that it seems like there is an agenda to actually destroy academia as we know it. So let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll dig into what your response might be. So first of all, Project 2025 does clearly, and the people who wrote it and the people who are now enacting it have clearly put the blame for many things on academics and particularly on professors. And it is a very scary situation right now because of all of the cuts, which feel and are sometimes like very random. So some of them are targeted in terms of like, we are cutting all grant funding, federal grant funding that has anything to do with diversity, equity, inclusion. But the random part of it comes through. It seems like they are searching for like keywords in titles of grants and cutting those first. But really, actually, across the board, we've seen cuts in all kinds of programs. And we've also seen messaging around an indirect cost shift, right? So something more like 15% indirect cost on grants instead of 50 or 60. And all of this has higher ed in an uproar, is very disruptive. You have probably been affected. And if you haven't been affected yet, you likely will be. So even I, obviously I run an academic adjacent business. So it remains to be seen what will happen with my business as we proceed. But even in my farm business, we've been affected. I had a grant written that was ready to be submitted, and they closed or froze the grant program. And that was a farming program. It was about equipment for the farm. So on the surface, it seems like, well, what would be the reason related to the agenda, especially if you're cutting money to farmers. But as we've seen, like the approach of this administration has been just kind of like hacking away, right? And with a kind of focus on exactly the kind of work that many of you do. So my next kind of series of podcasts is going to be very much talking about what to do now. But this episode is specifically about, is it time for me to think about leaving academia because of the president and the cuts and everything that is happening in the US? And I'll say, like, obviously, hello to all my international listeners. I know, especially Canadians are very aware and are very, like, everybody's aware, I think, but are very feeling the effects of all of this very poignantly, that the US has been the leader in attracting talent and funding research through federal government agencies, funding research and advancing science in higher ed. So it is a place that when the US's higher ed system gets disrupted, it does have implications all over the world. You know, I know that I can be US centric on this podcast, but I do feel like it's worth addressing this. Most of my listeners are in the US and Canada and are really affected by these federal grant programs getting cut. And it does have a ripple effect to other institutions. And I think everyone, it's not a bad idea to think like, should I still be in academia right now? Like, no matter where you are in the world, like reassessing occasionally, I think is not a bad idea. So yes, this episode and many of the following will be directly addressing the cuts to grant funding, particularly and the sentiment towards academia of the current US administration. And I think that it's important to talk about these things. So forgive me if my international listeners are like, this doesn't have anything to do with me. Hopefully you will still be able to get some good gems out of this episode. Okay, so one question to ask yourself when trying to answer, like, should I be thinking about quitting academia? Should I be thinking about moving because of the current political climate in the US? One thing to ask yourself is the industry of higher ed going away? Okay. So yes, I'm using the word industry. So higher ed is an industry, just like the tech industry, just like the dairy industry, just like anything else in capitalism, which is where we are. So we have to think about when these cuts happen to federal funding for research, what are the ramifications in the industry of academia, and how is the industry going to course correct in order to save itself? Okay. So the first question I thought of was like, okay, well, is the industry of academia going away? And I'm going to say probably not. And probably not, especially over the next 20 years, probably to the end of your career. Probably universities won't disappear. As institutions, universities have been around for a very long time, and they are self-correcting. They are maybe not self-correcting, as much as self-preserving. So one thing to ask yourself in the context of universities within capitalism, right, is what is there a market for? So universities are part of marketplaces. And one of the things that the university does, among many, is that there is always going to be a market for parents having educated children. Okay, so something to consider here is like, how do universities fill a necessary need in the marketplace for parents to have educated children? And also for industries to have prepared for professionals. So obviously, those things are, you might think, well, you can do that and just teach, but you can't. At the level of education that we're talking about, research is part of it. Industries need students who are prepared to do research. All kinds of industries do. So when you think like, are universities going to disappear? Is academia going to disappear? I would say no, there's always going to be a market for those educated professionals to go into the other kinds of jobs that there are out there in the world. Then, you can ask yourself, what type of institution are you at right now? What is your institution's role in the local community, in your state, and then also in the country and the world as a whole? So what type of institution are you at, and what is your institution's role in the local community, at the state level, the national and international level? What role is your institution playing? And this is going to help you look at like, okay, how is my university positioned as fulfilling the needs of others in these different contexts? You'll probably find, once you start thinking about this, that the university does serve a needed purpose at these different kind of levels. So really understanding what your institution's purpose is, what's their role, what's its role in the local, state, countrywide, international communities that it lives in. That's going to help you also know whether like, oh, am I bailing because I think that my university is going to disappear? All right. Another, like to drill down further, more questions to ask yourself as you think about this question about should you quit academia because of the current administration? How does your department serve your institution? So thinking about what is your department's role? How is the department connected to other departments? What work does it do inside of the institution? And then drilling down further, what is your role in the local community, in the state, in the larger research conversation? And these questions are meant to get you thinking like, okay, yes, there is a lot of disruption happening in higher ed right now. Is it a disruption that I feel like it is still within my best interest to participate in and still where I feel my vocation to participate in? Or do I want to think about doing something else with my life? I don't think right now, if you're in the US, I don't think right now going into a job outside of higher ed will erase any of the current problems that you're feeling right now inside of higher ed, especially because of the kind of level of work that you do. If you were to go, let's say, into a nonprofit, the grant cutting problem is going to be the same. Maybe if you were going to go work for a foundation or something like that, maybe, like you might. But I think that the problems that we're facing right now are problems that are society-wide in the US. And I'm sorry to say this, and I might be wrong. I would really like to be proved wrong. But it seems to me, from what I've been seeing and reading, that what many people in the US want right now is a big change. And they are getting that big change. Now, it might not have the result for them in their life that they wanted. But this desire for like a different kind of government, for things to be like really shaken up, I don't think it's a fluke, in other words. Like, I don't think that this guy got elected because people are dumb or whatever. They might be a little naive, but not, you know what I mean? They wanted something different. I'm not saying it was a good idea. I'm just saying, like, I think that the sentiment in the US, the culture of the US right now is changing in a way, or is being revealed, let's say, in a way that means that you going out of higher ed isn't going to change that culture. You're still not going to be able to, you're going to be running away from something that's happening inside of higher ed that's also affecting other places you would work outside of higher ed. Obviously, if you do a complete career pivot and you go from being a research scientist to running a local bakery, maybe. But I'm telling you, like, now I am helping my husband run a dairy business, and we are feeling the cuts. So the federal government and its funding is woven throughout all levels and all areas of life in the US. So these cuts will be felt throughout all areas, and the disruption of these cuts is going to be felt through all areas. So I think that considering these questions that I'm just really giving you on this podcast, a series of questions to ask yourself to help you think about this. But if you're looking to quit academia because you're thinking like, oh, I'm going to be safe somewhere else, I actually don't think that's true. And I'm sorry that that's like, sounds hard to hear maybe, but I think that what's happening now is a cultural, I don't want to say, it's a revealing of sentiment in the US that you're not going to be able to like avoid by leaving academia. That's what I'll say. Okay. So again, the purpose of this podcast is really to think about what kinds of questions do I want to ask myself to make a good choice about quitting or not. And then in further podcast episodes, I'm going to keep talking about this in terms of giving you guide questions for how to cope with where things are at right now and how things are going. How might your work change in the current political climate? That's another thing that, a question for you to ask yourself if you're thinking maybe I should quit or maybe I should start looking about how I can get out of academia because of the current administration. So how might your work change in the current political climate that you're in right now? Related question. How can you make the kind of contribution that you want to make? So as I've said many times on the podcast before, you are not the container, right? You do work, you get paid by, right? And you do work within a certain container. And for many of you, it is a professorship, okay? But that is not the only container through which you can do your work in the world. So I want you to think about the kind of contribution you want to make to the world, to your research area, to the people who your research is going to make their lives better or change their lives. What kind of contribution do you want to make? Be clear about that, and then operate from a place of groundedness, of belief in your value. Do not operate from fear. And again, easier said than done. And I know that it might be even a daily struggle not to operate and try to make decisions based on fear, but actually like remembering what is the contribution that I want to make inside of all of this? What is my purpose here? What is the purpose of my career? Ground yourself in that and make decisions based on that. So one thing that might help you here is just a little process of noticing, right? Notice if you're making decisions based on fear and stop and move forward with intention. So if you're asking yourself, well, let's say maybe a grant that you have been working on just got defunded and you're thinking, okay, well, maybe I should do something else completely. Maybe I should leave this university. Maybe I should do a research pivot. Or you might just be like, how am I going to survive and get my work done without these grant funds, right? All of that, those are very legitimate questions to ask. Notice if you're trying to make a decision based on fear, and then stop, say, oop, that was a fear-based thought that I just had. Let me try to move forward with intention, grounded in the belief in your value and your contribution in this world. That is what we need to all be coming back to as we keep seeing horrible news stories and we keep feeling change and we see colleagues affected and we see ourselves affected. There are real repercussions to all the things that are happening now that I know are affecting each and every one of you. And what I want you to think about this week is, what is my mission here? What am I doing with my career? How can I continue to do that in spite of all of these things that are going on? And asking yourself that question truly, not as a question that's said in a moment of despair, but as a question that's like, really, how can I? What is the mechanism through which I will continue to do the work? Because as I said, are there any better or more stable places outside of the academy right now? Like, really? I think, first of all, that the academy has had an illusion of safety. And this was something I realized when I started entrepreneurship, that I thought that my job was so safe. Like when I first got my professorship, I was like, yes, I got the tenure track job. I have a pension. We have cost of living raises every year. There's these different promotion scales. I'm going to get promoted. My salary is going to keep going up and will keep pace with cost of living. All of that is what was promised to me when I signed my contract with the university. But none of that is what happened. And I'm talking about the years from 2005 to 2020. Like, I'm not talking about the last 5 years. I'm talking about like those 15 years. Because we went through, as you might have heard me talk about on the podcast before, when Ley Promesa, when Puerto Rico went into bankruptcy, and there was an appointed directorate of non-elected people who decided the fate of the budget and are still deciding the fate of the budget in Puerto Rico. They decided that we would no longer get cost of living raises, that we wouldn't get promoted unless there was a budget to promote us. So I sat, approved for promotion, but not actually promoted with the pay raise for 3 years. This is something that could happen to you. And I'll say this, I'm not trying to freak everybody out, but since everybody's freaking out anyway, let me say that the stability that you think you have in academia is an illusion. And if you can accept that, you actually are going to be more safe because you're going to protect yourself and you're going to be taking steps for your own safety and not relying on the perceived safety of the institution. So what do I mean? I work with a lot of academics. Every year, I probably work with between like 75 and 100 people. And that's new people. And I've been working with people for a long time. So I have watched people have their universities overtaken by other universities. I've watched people been told to cut their departments and are in charge of cutting their department from the university, firing everybody and themselves last. I've watched universities go out of business, like close their doors. I've watched austerity cuts of all kinds happen in all kinds of institutions. We've seen COVID happen, where people have had to make this giant pivot with their research. I've seen people lose their research lines because they no longer can go to the countries where they researched. The list is long for ways in which the university is not as stable as you think. So how do you get stability? It goes back to what I said before, knowing your work in the world, knowing this is what I want to accomplish, and there are many ways to accomplish it. There's not just one way. And then when you have that, making decisions, intentionally making decisions, not making decisions based on fear, working through fear, not deciding because of fear, deciding through your groundedness in your value, the value your contribution is making to the world, and your values, right? Like the values that you operate under every day. So if you think I'm going to leave academia because I'm going to go into a safer industry, I actually think that academia is not that safe and not that stable. At the same time that I said at the beginning of this podcast that it is self-correcting, right? What I want to say is I don't think academia is going away, but I don't think that universities are prioritizing your safety, your stability. They are always prioritizing their stability. And so if they have to cut you in order to keep their stability, that's what they will do. So instead, you have to find stability in other ways. So should you leave academia because of who's in the government right now? I don't think that should be your reason. You can have lots of other reasons, but maybe that one isn't it. Instead, I want you to think of how can you create safety for yourself? How can you find connection in community with others who share your values, who are living through this time now? That is what's going to get us through however long this is. All right. So to wrap, some things to think about. Where does your university's funding come from? Are you at a university with a big endowment that's relying on lots of indirect costs, that is funded by state money, that is funded by mostly donors or alumni? If you don't know, you need to find out, because as you are looking for ways to fund your work, you need to know what's already happening at your university and how you can tap into different kinds of funding sources. That's going to be true for everyone. And I'll be doing more podcast episodes about that. It's like, how do you think about funding differently now that, like, for example, you can't rely on NIH funding? It's a huge question. I don't have like a brilliant answer for it, but I will, again, like my approach in the next several podcast episodes is going to be thinking about like, okay, how to self-coach, right? Like how to think about what's happening now, how to approach it in a way that's going to be fruitful for you and not panicky, fearful, full of despair. Because listen, I very much know that that's part of the process, is to panic and feel fear and be full of despair, but we can't stay there. We have to keep moving. So I hope that this episode has helped you to think about, should I quit academia because of who is in government right now? I hope it's helped you to question the stability, not in a way to freak you out, but in a way that, a lot of people think that being a professor is a pretty stable job, but I have seen all the ways in which it is not. So I encourage you to really think about and really go back to that core thing that I was talking about. What is your work in the world?
operate from that place of groundedness, from the belief in the value that you bring to the world. Make decisions from there. And not only will you get through this, but you will create something amazing even during this time. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I should say before the end of this episode that we are enrolling in Navigate. Enrollment will be in April for a May start. So if you'd like more information, please do not hesitate to get on the wait list for Navigate. You can go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate and click the pink button that says get on the wait list now. All right, take good care. Bye.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time supporting yourself and your writing by listening to this episode. If you like what you heard today, the best way to say thank you is to hop on over to Apple iTunes and write an honest review. The more reviews, the more amazing academic women and non-binary people will find this podcast. So go write one now.